I guess my main question is like, just to like kind of make sure I understood the message correctly, or the conversation, I guess. So basically, what you're saying, like the solution, I guess, is to like not act on it. Like, does that make sense?
Sure, I totally get that question. Um, in one sense, maybe what I'd want to say more broadly is like a word solution, I think, is tough, or sometimes a word that I know has been like weaponized against gay folks. So I don't know, and I'm not saying that you're bad because you said it or I'm bad because I suggested. It's just like if I'm talking to everyone in the room about, what do I think is a livable outcome for gay folks within the church, my hunch is I just want to create plausibility for there being, whether it's singleness, whether there's folks that I know people that are in this really unique category called mixed orientation marriage, which we could talk about, which has got a whole other lot of landmines, but it's worth talking about. But I wanted to create plausibility for following Jesus in light of what I think is Jesus's embrace of the historic Christian sexual ethic, and for that being something that's actually livable and fruitful and fulfilling for gay people. I mean, just growing up for me, that was not a category that existed. I think churches, it was either like gay people are all bad and so they shouldn't be in our church at all, or it was this is totally unlivable to actually follow Jesus' ethics, so we should change some of Scripture's teaching. And the more that I've been around and met people and asked a bunch of questions and discovered, it's like, oh, there is a way to both follow Jesus in light of his commitments to historic Jewish teaching, which I think became Christian teaching, which I think is God's design, and live as a gay person within the church. And so that's what I was hoping to just create an imaginative category for and say, oh, this is possible some way, somehow.
Okay.
Can you bring it down a little bit? You know what I mean? Thanks. Awesome. Hey, okay, that's all good. Can you hear me? Awesome. Hey, so one of my best friends is gay and has grown up as a Catholic his entire life. So I guess the question he's asking me to ask you is, their teaching is a little bit different than it is here at Mosaic. He doesn't feel like he's welcome where he goes because of the Catholic faith. How would I, how do I, obviously I support him 110%, but at the same time, how do I connect him with the Catholic faith since that's what he's decided to,
Yeah, so maybe for everyone more broadly, and I'm imagining, and I don't know your friend, but I'd imagine there's even a stronger category in kind of Catholic tradition around this theology of the body. It's a great book. It's a dense book by Pope John Paul II, but even probably going a few steps further than what I said about maleness, femaleness, and fittedness. So a lot of folks know Catholic teaching around contraception, right? Meaning they're not really into it. You just extend that a little further and you can imagine the kind of things that might exist within Catholic communities around this topic. I don't know, a few thoughts are there is an organization within the Catholic Church I know of called Courage. I don't know if it's good here, so this is the danger in a Q&A. I don't know if it exists here, but it's a movement for gay people within the Catholic Church that want to be faithful to Catholic teaching. It's called Courage. Not sure if they're around in the Baltimore area.
Yeah,
It's not here. Okay.
No.
Well, there you go. That's all I got. No, I'm kidding. But that was one thing. So there are these kind of movements within the Catholic Church that are looking to like, can we make this livable? I think more broadly, if as a friend you could remain committed and supportive and recognizing, and I've got this for friends that are both, I don't know, whether it's gay friends that are in churches that don't know what to do with them, or honestly, and let's just scratch all the tough topics, but a lot of friends who are women who work in churches that don't really know what to do with them. If I'm thinking, how do I care well for them? It's recognizing that for the long haul, they're probably in a place of tension that's exhausting and tiring and can at times feel dehumanizing, whether or not that's the intent of the folks there or not. And so just having that category as a friend and checking in on that, praying through that, supporting through that, I think could be massive. And even you bringing it up instead of your friend having to bring it up to say, hey, just wanted to check in, how's this going? I mean, all those things would be a great way to care for a friend. If your friend does feel really, convinced that they need to stay in the Catholic Church, I'd say, all right, this is what it is, this is what teaching is, you're in this for the long haul, how can I continue to be a support? It's just recognizing that there's likely to be a lot of friction and that you as a friend can be a really safe place in the midst of that. Or invite them to Mosaic, is that what you were going to say?
No, but I was waiting for you to say it.
I know. My bad. No,
That's good.
Yeah.
I do know you mentioned that one conference, that's within Catholicism, but there's a conference you're a part of nationally.
Yeah.
Why don't you just talk about that a little bit, because you talk so highly of it.
Yeah, I've worked with this organization. It's a newer organization called Revoice, and yes, and it's just a space for Christians, LGBTQ, that would identify with the historic Christian sexual ethic. So there's a few different conferences for gay folks within the church. Revoice is one that's like, hey, we're gay, but we identify with the historic Christian teaching around sexuality. And so a friend of mine, Nate, started it. I've been a part of it for, I think we just had our third conference. It's all a blur to me. It's been great. But that is a space that I absolutely love. It meets every summer, usually in St. Louis, this year online. And there's awesome people that speak there and good community that's formed there. And yeah, I love it.
That's great. Okay, let's go back this side.
First of all, thank you for being here. You came at just the right time for me and my family. My question involves the scientific question of whether you can be born gay or not, and whether that's even an important question, or does it miss the point?
Yeah. I would say in some ways it misses the point. And in some ways scientifically, there's a few ways to start. So in terms of missing the point, I'll say what I mean by that is, on a theological sense, we're already in a faith that says people are, born all kinds of ways, and that's all right, and that there's an invitation for everyone, no matter how they're born, to follow Jesus. And so on a macro theological level, I'm not sure that conversation is always fruitful, because some folks want to use it to say, hey, if I'm born this way, I shouldn't follow Jesus, or I don't need to. Other folks want to use it to say, you could never be born gay because God wouldn't do that. And it just gets in these like weird periphery categories. It reminds me of this incident where Jesus healed this guy who was born blind. And it was honestly the religious leaders and Pharisees saying, who sinned that this man was born blind? In other words, whose fault is this? And Jesus is like, you're asking all the wrong questions. So that's how I usually think about the born this way debate. But then in terms of how people scientifically are addressing it, there's really fascinating research there. I have a hunch, because you did a series on this, the science and faith conversation, that we're okay talking a little bit of science in this space. There's just great conversation and really fruitful sex research now about whether or not there's what they call epigenetic causes for being gay. So that's, if you follow genetics world, it's not like, oh, there's a gay gene, but is there some ways that a bunch of genes might work together? And then, of course, some nurture could come along or not come along. I mean, there's all these kinds of debates, but there's active, open questioning in the scientific community about what's the cause of this experience for humans. And the reason I bring that up is because, can I get really reckless? Okay. The reason I bring that up is because in our country now, for political reasons that I understand, we've really needed to lean into language around born this way to get basic rights and human protection, all right? So it's been the most politically expedient way to get, even for gay folks with whom, even if we theologically disagree, should a gay person be able to visit their spouse in the hospital or something like this? And if I'm putting my cards on the table, it's like I'd say yes. In order to get those laws changed, we've had to really mobilize behind a slogan of Born This Way that actually is not consensus. If you'd ask the smartest sexologists at Harvard, if you'd read Serena Nanda, if you'd go to the Kinsey Sex Institute at IU, there is more complexity around the source of gay desire or what it means to be gay, but that hasn't been politically expedient language. So even our political language differs from the scientific language that differs from the theological importance of that question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I think it's even helpful for some of these questions to think, how do we answer them theologically for heterosexuals? Because if someone comes to me and says, I slept with someone who's not my wife because I just had a natural urge, Jesus says that's not okay. You had that urge.
Sure.
That's not okay. And I remember Rick Warren was interviewed, I forget if it was CNN or 60 Minutes, it was one of the big things. And they brought up the gay question and what he believes. And she responded with that question of, well, what about people who have her phrase was, have a natural inclination towards that? And he looked at her with a big smile and said, I'm naturally inclined to want to have sex with every beautiful woman I meet. And she was kind of attractive, so it got really uncomfortable really quick. But I love the boldness of that answer to own his own brokenness, and he's saying, I'm not here to point fingers.
Yeah.
Like, me too.
Sure.
I better not follow my feelings. And I think sometimes that question can get wrapped up in finger pointing is what I'm getting at, as opposed to, well, hold up, I'm looking in the mirror when I answer this question.
Well, and probably the one thing to add to that conversation is, from a lived experience perspective, sometimes when folks are debating the born this way, not born this way question, there's another category that enters about like the when did you choose to be gay can be a natural follow-up question. And I mean, to your point, Carl, it's like when did you choose to be straight could be the counter side of that question. And I just think that's a category that was introduced from some Christian organizations that maybe existed in the 80s and 90s that, I mean, some of that thinking kind of evaporated away about choice and gay choice. And I'll just tell you, from all the many, many, many gay folks I've met, and being, myself, it's just like, there's not like a choosing moment where it's like, okay, I'm gonna choose to like feel this way or have this orientation. But that's often maybe nervous suspicion that gay people might have when that conversation comes up. It's like, you're ready to pounce and ask me when I chose this. And just from a lived experiential thing, it's just more something that you notice, and then it's like, okay, what am I gonna do with this?
Okay, so let me push back a little bit on that.
Push a bit, yeah.
Because it seems to reference something we mentioned in passing in the message portion of today, it seems that many young people do choose to be gay.
Sure.
It's trendy. It's trendy to be trans. And literally, I'm not like,
I know,
making this up. It's trendy to be trans, it's trendy to be gay. It's, you kind of get an eye roll if you're a straight person attracted to the opposite sex. So how would you speak, what's the difference between that and what you're talking about?
Well, so this is where we get into the fun science research too, and this is fascinating. And again, this is Harvard. This isn't, I don't know, some Christian study place with a bias or something. Sometimes people are nervous. But there's great sex research. Again, how honest can we be in this one?
Fully,
okay.
110%.
There's people that have done studies of what they call the exportation of gay culture to places like Papua New Guinea, or places that wouldn't have had categories for what it means to have settled gay orientation. So in Papua New Guinea, there was a practice where like a rite of passage to become a fully grown man was to have a sexual experience with an older man. Now I'm a full man, and now, I marry my wife. I mean, there's a great, reading some of this sociology, it's just like, so the sociologist or anthropologist, is asking like this tribal leader in Papua New Guinea, so did you do this practice too? You did this thing with an older man to become a man? And he's like, yeah, how do you think I got my beard? So it's this, which that's just the stuff,
of course,
the nerdy things I read, that's what sticks out. But the idea is this, that practice ended when Western media arrived in Papua New Guinea. And some of the research conclusions, and again, this is why I think Christians don't need to be afraid. If we believe all truth is God's truth, let's follow research. They said there is something about a cultural moment that can shift perceptions of sex, sexuality. I mean, even sex object choice is cultural. So in the United States, a great illustration a professor used is like, think of, Beyonce's Super Bowl outfit. We're like, okay, I guess she's at least decently covered up, and there's people around the world that would be like, no, if your thighs are out, that's terrible. Who cares if your breasts are covered? That's just for feeding babies. We can't believe your thighs are on display. So all that to say, there's more things that are cultural than we realize. There's ways that culture can influence sex object choice. And that's how I think about this current cultural moment we're in the US. You're exactly right, where it's like there is a moment where plausibility for same-sex desire or plausibility for all kinds of identities are more present than they have been. I think what I'd want to say in response is it probably still doesn't feel like choice, because as they say in sociology world, the last thing the fish notices is the ocean, right? So it's like, I want to say it wouldn't feel like that on a lived experiential level for those teenagers. And yet, and again, this is something we can't talk about in our country because we've got politics we need to contend with as well. But if you just follow the best sex research, something about a culture can either create or kill plausibility for different kinds of sexualities. And so now, how do you navigate all that as a Jesus follower? And that's why you have a great pastor like Carl. But that is the messy stuff, though. That's the messy stuff that's happening.
Yeah, and we experience this in our student ministry more than any other environment in our church for obvious reasons, right? I mean, that's the forefront of it. That's the age where your sexuality is coming alive, and it's, put in their faces, all these questions and options. And so it's really tough to navigate with grace and truth.
Totally.
Let's do a question over here.
You kind of already went there, so that's kind of helpful. Can you even hear me? But anyways, my question is, so I had a gay mother. I found out when I was 13 that she had an affair, and that's why my father decided he couldn't fix her. And now, as coming to my faith as an adult, which I now have 2 beautiful children that I'm raising in this world, and coming to knowing the truth and to seeing the truth even in pursuit of her and loving her regardless of her choices and her desires and so forth, how do you look at today's culture and the experiences of, for example, the Disney Channel, every channel, all of it is just so in your face, and what are some suggestions you can give to parents? Because my initial instinct is to not create hatred, but awareness. I want love to obviously always show, but at the same time, as a Christian, I'm trying to teach truth. And how would you give some feeders on how to do that and make sure that I'm not creating children who are going to be bigots later in life because I'm telling them the truth and not allowing them to watch certain things, but also telling them to love in that sense?
Yeah. I think this is a very, very tough challenge for parents, and the tension that you identified, in my view, is the right tension. So the tension is there hasn't been any kind of visibility or representation of gay folks for so long. Now that it's there, it can be scary for some folks, and we both want to create an environment where it's like, hey, we are kind, respectful, humanizing, we get it, we care, and there's a conviction we would have about what following Jesus looks like or doesn't look like that we want to teach as well. So I think the best thing you can do as a parent is to give some like macro level handholds that are solid for your kids. So, I mean, the first few that come to mind is like, yeah, because we follow Jesus, we love and respect everyone. You know, because we follow Jesus, we see the image of God in people, and we, treat folks with kindness. We extend them dignity and honor. We, all these different things, right, that we would say are true of Jesus followers. And because we follow Jesus, we have this sexual ethic that some folks might find odd, old-fashioned, quirky. It shapes our convictions. We don't expect it of people that don't follow Jesus. I mean, that's where I think the church gets gets in trouble a lot, is expecting those who wouldn't even claim to follow Jesus to do something that's hard for people that even do follow Jesus to do. So it's like, if you can create those categories for your kids, I mean, in many, many areas, not just in this conversation, but in many areas, that will be helpful over the long haul. But those are the kinds of things I'd want to do. Like, Jesus following shapes who we are. It means we're very kind. It also means we believe these things, and we can do both.
Also, I want to speak into that as well, because I think sometimes what happens is there's something that triggers, that crosses the line in us in media.
Yeah.
And if we're drawing the line and saying everything else is okay, but that's wrong, then we probably miss something along the way. So I think when that happens, it's a chance for me to look in the mirror and say, what have I actually been saying is okay for my kids to watch in the first place? In our house, I don't let our kids watch any of those like teenage type shows on Disney or Netflix, because they all have 3 themes. Your parents are stupid, follow your feelings, and mean sarcasm is funny. All 3 of those are lies from the pit of hell.
Yeah.
And so if they bring in a gay character and that makes me realize, oh, this is based on lies in the first place, whatever, but I should have drawn the line way back here, because that's just inevitable.
Yeah, that's good.
Right? I think we have to, be careful. Art is helpful.
Yeah.
Mindless entertainment is not.
It's good.
Let's go over here.
Hello.
Hi.
I guess my question is, since a lot of it was about sexuality, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your theology regarding gender, and kind of with that, what Christianity looks like for a fully transitioned trans person.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking that.
I think that's awesome. And this is where I want to lean in again. It's probably clear that I love like broad, macro, start with the big ideas and work my way down. So in one sense, when it comes to like, what does Christianity look like for a fully transitioned trans person, I'd want to say there are ways in which that experience has to be really, really difficult, in that there's so much misunderstanding culturally, and I'm sure then misunderstanding within the church, that I'd say, I mean, what does that look like, or how could it even be? I mean, my first and foremost response is like, gosh, I really, really, really hope that a church for a trans person would have strong categories of hospitality, welcome, graciousness, care. I mean, that's how people knew that folks in the early church were like really saved. I mean, now it's like, do they wear their church shirt? Do they have their bumper sticker? In the early church, it was like, how does this person show hospitality to someone unlike them? That's how we know they're truly following Jesus. And it's like, I would just love for that to come back. So like, first and foremost, it's like, okay, someone's church experience, I hope it'd be shaped by hospitality. I'd hope it'd be shaped by generous welcome. And then on a theological sense, what do we do with this experience of, I feel like my gender doesn't match my birth at sex, and how do I navigate that? The easiest place for me to start thinking about that is in this theology we have in Christianity called the fall. And I think the fall is misunderstood. The fact that the world is fallen doesn't mean you're bad and you choose this and you're sinful for this and you're sinful for that. And it's like, sure, that might be part of it, that there's sin in people, but it also means the world is not the way it's supposed to be, which is how this guy Cornelius Plantinga puts it, or that everything is broken even to the deepest levels. So what I would want to say is like, is this kind of confusion that happens, or this kind of dysphoria, or this kind of like mismatch that I think is very real for some folks, like, is this part of like what God intended, or is this part of the fall? I'd want to say, oh, this is not the way it's supposed to be, and that life should never be that difficult for anyone. I don't think God made it that way. I think our world has become that way, but I don't think that's something God like designed for folks to have to navigate this complex thing. And so then a Christian response is very much like, so what do we do now in light of the fact that we lived in a broken world? And that's where some really, really thoughtful folks, a friend of mine, Julius Sadusky, is a great sex researcher and psychologist, a guy, Mark Yarhouse, there's other folks that are trying to navigate the what now in Jesus following in light of, like, what do we do with this reality of trans people? And I would say that it's still a new enough conversation that pastorally, my biggest goal is just to make sure that the Jesus story and following Jesus remains the main story. And still, what does this mean practically is still one that I'm learning a lot about. But in terms of like, is this something that, yeah, is part of the fall, isn't the way it's supposed to be, is really difficult and needs a whole lot of help from the church to navigate? That's where I can plant a strong, strong flag. And then what do we do now is a place where it's like, I'm still learning a whole lot from these experts.
You have quoted, do you have a follow-up question, or what'd you think of that?
Yeah, what did I miss? Be honest.
I think, yeah. I guess the thought there is, if the process of being, I guess, fallen is a sin, and for a lot of things involving sexuality, it's the continuation of either involving yourself in that kind of like relationship is considered sinful. Being trans and having transitioned and continuing to live a life that is considered like not what you're supposed to be, is that continuing to like live in sin by being transitioned?
It's good.
See, yeah, I love that. And that's where you're asking a great question. And maybe that is where to put some of my cards on the table. There's parts of the fall, or the fact that the world is not the way it's supposed to be, where humans are kind of like culpable. And it's like, yeah, I know God's law, I'm choosing against it. I know this is real, I'm not going to do that. There are some parts of the fall that are just like, man, this is a devastating reality, not part of God's design, and it really is a now what? I mean, I know I keep returning to John 9, but, you know, again, who sinned that this man was born blind? I think what that question is even getting at is like, there must be someone morally culpable, something that happened here, and we're going to find blame. And Jesus' response, even in that moment in John 9, is like, no, like, I'm about to intervene. I'm going to do something here that's redemptive. And so in my mind, especially in something so complex as like a trans experience, it really is like, gosh, I want to care for you. This is heartbreaking. And I want to extend the invitation to follow Jesus, because that's for everyone. And because this is such a new conversation, we're not quite certain what it like totally looks like, and should you do this or not do this? And there's wisdom that says, gosh, go ahead and be, transition surgery. Some folks say that. There's other people that say they regret their transition surgery. That's what I mean, where it's like, I don't know. I mean, it's still really fresh. I read all the time, and yet I think there's still a way. There has to be a way, because I'm convinced there's always a way to follow Jesus faithfully, to recognize that we live inside of a broken world. And that's one for me personally, that I wouldn't be so upset about like culpability or who's at fault here, and would put more in that category of like, gosh, really broken world, really tough experience. There is a way to follow Jesus that I as a pastor and we as a church want to point you towards and walk with you in. And how do we do that? I mean, that's the tough work of pastoring, honestly.
And so what you're saying is, if someone has, by biologically transition
Yeah.
from a man to a woman or from
Yeah.
a woman to man. There's nothing in Scripture that would say because of a decision you made with your body that you are the worst of sinners, or you are irredeemable,
Not at
or
all.
you
Yeah.
are fully living in sin as compared to someone else who wouldn't be, who'd done things different.
Exactly. And there's nothing to say, like, again, in the what now? Like, because some folks, and I think these are pastors that are quick to rush. And do I think this will be a continual conversation in our lifetime? Yes. But is it like, you should immediately get a surgery to go in the other direction? You should do this, you should do that. I think a lot of those are premature prescriptions that are easier to lob out in an article on a popular Christian website than
Yeah.
when there's people that are with you that you're pastoring. So that's exactly what I'm saying, Carl. No worse of a sinner, no damage, no this. And we're in for a long discipleship journey. Let's become friends. Let's get comfortable.
Yeah.
Let's figure this out. And I do think it's going to be one of the, I don't know, pastoral complexities that we've got to work through in this time. But
Yeah.
it's not like it's clear and settled in my mind.
I read this scary article several years ago that kind of traced all the presidential elections going back to the 70s maybe.
Sure.
And it showed that whoever had the best catchphrase won,
Yeah.
which is really scary. That's us, that's America.
Yeah.
But the tough thing navigating sexuality is there's no there's no good catchphrase.
Yeah.
There's no catchy platitude that sums everything up in a way that fits on a coffee mug.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so the question I have about that is you keep referencing all these authors. And I've read Yarhouse, I've read
Yeah.
Wesley Hill, I've read, some other ones with different views. Most people watching are probably not as big of readers as you or I when it comes to this type of stuff.
Yeah.
So I want to ask two questions. One, give me some resources if someone is
Yeah.
a big reader and thinking of Christian sexuality, and then give me what to do if I'm not a big reader.
Yeah.
What should I do to keep learning and investigating?
Yeah. I really love this guy, Preston Sprinkle. He has the Center for Faith, Gender, and Sexuality. He wrote a book called People to be Loved that I think is good, but even better is some of the work they've produced at this center. There's a video curriculum. There's awesome articles. It's, again, called the Center for Faith, Gender, Sexuality. They are at the cutting edge. Love Preston Sprinkle. My buddy Greg writes for them. It's like that is awesome and incredibly accessible. So
Great.
I would say that's like the low-hanging fruit, the easiest point of entry. When you've talked about Wesley Hill, I think Wes is great. So Wes has a book called Spiritual Friendship that's very much asking like what's livable for gay folks that might have a historic Christian sexual ethic. A good buddy of mine, David Bennett, just wrote an awesome book. Another guy, Greg Coles. These are all great.
Okay, you have to stop now.
Am I doing too many? Yeah.
That's a lot.
Sorry. Okay.
What about the person who's not a voracious reader?
Yeah. It's so hard, Carl. I'm trying to imagine what that would even be like. There's good podcasts out there in the world too. And I mean, even for someone who's not a voracious reader, I would say that, so Brian Loritz, who's an awesome pastor, did a series called My Gay Neighbor. That's probably the best one to listen to.
Okay.
If you're just looking for someone to listen to, you can find it, you can Google it. And on a broader level, I do think like listening is just really helpful. Stories are helpful, even as you were saying. There's good art, and then maybe there's different kinds of, I don't know, television or media, but just to be exposed to a few, I don't know, humanizing stories around gay world and think about, gosh, what would that be like if that were me? And what would that be like if I was trying to suggest someone follows Jesus in light of that? Like that imaginative exercise could be really helpful for
Great.
folks too.
Let's go over here.
Oh, wow, you're not a blur. So, two shout outs first. Number one, so a shout out and a word of thanks to the leadership of Mosaic for actually having the fact that we do have our Mosaic LGBTQ plus group. I think we are probably relatively rare amongst American conservative evangelical churches that has one. So thank you for your leadership. I want to thank our leader, who's actually unfortunately not here. He's at Crucible this weekend. But David Klerman gets a special shout out for his leadership to help you all see the wisdom of having a group such as this. Number one, shout out. Number two, go Hoosiers. So as probably the only other Indiana University alumnus here. My question, this is really easy. Can you fix American evangelical Christianity such that the reason I say that in that way is that we in the LGBTQ plus community have been given so many negative messages that have driven so many of us away from the church. What is it that we can do to fix it? That's easy.
Sure.
Fix the American church. Go.
Yeah. Well, here's what I say a lot, and tell me more if there needs more answer. But when I get to talk to pastors a lot, I often reference a 1969 New York Times op-ed written by Don Teal. So Don Teal is one of the famous first gay historians that existed. But Don Teal wrote a New York Times op-ed in 1969, so the year of the Stonewall riots. This is where gay pride comes from. That's called "Why Can't We Live Happily Ever After 2?" And in it, and this is hard for us to imagine, we've already mentioned media today, there used to be a different media world as recent as 1969, where Don Teal says there's no gay characters in media, there's no gay characters in movies that have a, quote, happy ending, meaning they all, all their lives end in suicide or drug addiction or despair or just this existential loneliness. And Teal's asking in this article, hey, why can't we live happily ever after 2? And I would say, it goes a step further. It's a problem of imagination. It's I have no heroes. I have no one to look at. I have no plausibility for what, a contented, happy life could be. All I see are these bad images. And so every time I talk with pastors trying to do my little part, there's just one sweet person, trying to change stuff. It's you need to have an answer for that in your church. So what is the quote unquote livable, quote unquote happy ending for gay folks that come into your church, right? What does it look like over the long haul to have a meaningful, livable, fulfilling, contented, deeply connected existence in your church? And then how are you elevating or sharing that story or sharing that more broadly with LGBT people in your church? And I think that is massive. I mean, there's many, many problems, but if I had to identify one, it is a problem of the imagination. We've been so tainted by some bad books and some bad theology that predate us, and that's colored people's ideas of what they should expect or shouldn't expect of gay people, what they should say or not say to gay people. So I think there's a huge problem of the imagination, and I always love to bring, Teal's question up to the forefront, but it's I believe there is an answer. I mean, hopefully if anything stuck out from our conversation earlier, I do believe that there's joy in following Jesus, there's peace, wholeness, love, truth, there's all these lovely things in it, but to put that into practice and make that evident in a church takes a little work, and that's work that I think a lot of pastors or church communities like to duck out of, and if I could do one thing, that would be that thing.
Can I ask a brief follow-up? How do you get them to not duck out? Because their ducking out is tremendously harmful to that community.
Yeah. So I'm kind of a kill 'em with kindness kind of person, and I say this all the time to other.
You are a Midwesterner.
I am, yeah, through and through. But say this all the time. So usually when you're meeting with a pastor, meeting with someone, and I haven't got to do this to you yet. Now you'll know all my tools. No, but when I'm meeting with folks, there's usually so much to affirm in a community and so much to love and all this, and then you usually, and I say this to gay folks all the time who are talking with their pastors, you get one shot to say something that'll stick in someone's head, and here's what I usually say to pastors or to university presidents, Christian college presidents that don't want to talk about sexuality on their college campus. I'll say, you're abdicating your responsibility as a Christian leader in shepherding this next generation. And it's by not talking about it, by being too afraid, by not listening to people that are already part of your institution. I mean, there's a particular Christian college coming to mind where they're it's just better not to talk about it, not to talk about it. And it's and you say you wanted to create culture makers for the future. It's what a joke. And so usually, and I've found, you get that one chance, you use it sparingly, pray against pride. I'm not here to be some kind of prophet. I'm not saving the church, but it's just but Jesus was prophetic. The Baptist had this prophetic edge. If I get to say one tough thing to a church leader, it's do not check out of this, because it's your responsibility. And whether or not you shepherd people or disciple people in your church in this time, you're accountable for that. And whatever people learn or don't learn, it happens on your watch. And if you will let someone feel the weight of that in leadership, those that are walking with Jesus, I trust that weight sticks with them. So again, use sparingly. If you do it too much, it's like the boy who cried wolf. But used effectively and used prayerfully and in the right moment, it's I love planting that seed and helping, pastors and church leaders realize, gosh, if you're not wading into this, that's on you. Like, that's on you. And you're letting folks down, and you're not being the shepherd God's called you to be. Yeah.
Thanks.
How do you have this conversation with gay married individuals that have children, and what does that mean for them in terms of where they go from here?
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah. You're reading, and by reading, you're not reading, but my master's thesis was in this very question about ethics, sexual ethics, and what do we do with what will be, I mean, if not already, a bigger and bigger reality in churches of gay couples coming to churches with their kids, checking them into children's ministry. And in that sense, what I often say, and I think this came through in our conversation, or hope it did as well, like, there's many ingredients to spiritual formation. One of them is time. And so usually there's a lot of time in our lives that got us to the point where we meet Jesus. And I would say that there's then usually a lot of time in our lives, sometimes equal to the time of our lives that took it to get us to that point, is the time of our lives that takes us to learn what it means to follow Jesus now in a new reality. So all of that to say, things that I'm thinking through in those situations is like, what's good for the kids? What's stable and healthy? What's not going to unsettle things? How do we love parents well? And I have seen all kinds of ways that churches navigate that well in terms of couples. I mean, sometimes this happens, a couple comes to faith and both of them say, gosh, we don't want to be married anymore, but we want to be together for our kids. And what do we do now? Sometimes they say we do want to stay married and want to have our kids. And we don't. I mean, so there's all kinds of situations. The thing that maybe I'd want to add to the conversation is just like, okay, what do we do with time? What do we do with increasingly making, the Jesus story the main story in our life? How do we think well about all the different people involved in this story? But you're right. I mean, that's a very, very complex moral dilemma. What I would hope would happen immediately is that a children's ministry in a church would be prepared to not make those kids feel shamed or weird or awkward or like they're the odd ones out. I mean, that's the kind of thing a church can do immediately and should be ready for and prepared for, in my humble opinion, right? And then onward for there in terms of discipling the adults, it is just that messy work of discipleship of saying, okay, like, what do you think? What do you think Jesus says? How do we do this in light of that? And there's a variety of ways that it winds up looking. That's maybe my first thought.
I also think sometimes people want to know, what's your end game for me, right?
Yeah.
And my end game for you is that you have a saving relationship with Jesus. And I think I know what his end game is for you as well, practically. But what I'm really concerned about is loving you into the next step.
Yes.
And there's probably going to be, if I have someone I'm related to or someone I'm best friends with in that situation, there's going to be about 10,000 steps, 10 million steps before like the biggest questions even. So how can I get you to do step one? How can I live in such a way that gets you to step one? What's the end of it? I think I know, but I'm not sure, so I'm not even going to speak to it. I want you to come to church with me, right? Or will you take a chance and read this Christian book that's not even about anything we're talking about or something like that. So I think in some of those complex issues, it's, will you take a risk, you being the other person, and just take one step with me here and see what happens?
Yeah.
Let's go over here.
Hello, my name's Alex. Thank you for your message today. Just a little background, I am also a gay Christian. I attend the LGBTQ plus Bible study here at Mosaic. And I just wanted to talk on the subject about relatable mentorship and maybe dive into your personal experience on that. And I was curious to know whether you, in your journey to come to the conclusion of celibacy for your life, if you had a mentor that helped you, or if you had a mentor that that had that same viewpoint as you, who accepted a calling to celibacy in their life, one, and then two, if you also were able to have the perspective of the other side of somebody who is a gay person, a gay Christian, and who you respect and see as a mentor, and if you had both of those perspectives while in your journey. And I guess an opinion-based question is, do you think that it's necessary, or maybe necessary to have that in your journey, or do you see having the other side as dangerous?
Sure.
You got all that?
I do, yeah.
Okay, and let me just say before you answer, we'll cover everybody who's standing up, and then we'll do some wrap up. But go
Great,
ahead, tackle
great.
Alex's question.
So I think that mentorship is massive. In fact, I was talking with Carl earlier, unrelated topic, but just saying that like heroes matter. I think a huge way that humans learn is through imitation of heroes. And so heroes are huge, mentors are huge. And I have been spoiled in having so many mentors in my life, particularly in this area, and particularly to your question, people that would have mixed Christian opinions about what I should do in light of being gay. So there's so many ways people frame, like how do you talk about the two perspectives that can live under a Christian umbrella. So some say side A, side B, some affirming, non-affirming, progressive, historic. There's complexity with all of them. But yes, I've had kind of key mentors and key friends that remain key friends in both camps. One of the best experiences of my life was the summer of 2013, living in downtown Chicago with a guy who's about 8 years older than me, similar story, called to celibacy, and that's the summer I learned how to cook, make cocktails. We went to theater all the time and talked about life nonstop, and it was, I mean, foundational for me, especially at the time, seeing that there's contented, joyful life in Christ over the long haul. So yes, mentorship is huge. Yes, I think that it matters that people are open to that and people get to experience it. And then maybe to your question on mentors from both sides, this is something I say all the time to folks, especially when I'm in a pastoral moment. And I loved what you said, taking the next best step. It's like, I encourage people, and this might be risky, but when folks come out to me, particularly as younger adults, I say, let's not rush to any decisions. And we should read together. I'd love to read the best books from both sides. There's great books that are affirming and great books that are not affirming. There's great books that are, in both camps. It's like, I want to read the best representatives of each side. And the reason I do that is because I'm so confident that following Jesus the way even I'm following Jesus is beautiful, is true, is pure, is captivating, that it's like we need to do our due diligence to survey everything that's out there in the world. And I think over time, as you see Jesus, as you see me, as you see other stuff, it's like you'll be persuaded, but we don't need to rush into it because this is a decision or series of decisions or series of steps, as you said, that will affect your whole life. And if you wind up in any kind of a similar spot to where I am, it's like, it's weird. People will ask you about it all the time. You'll feel out of touch in some conservative religious communities. I mean, I go to churches sometimes that people have asked, like, do you really think you should be a pastor? I go to some more liberal churches sometimes where people say, why are you leading everyone to commit suicide? And so it's like, if you're gonna make this kind of decision, you should think about it for a while. So I'm usually telling people, like, this is not a week's thing, a month's thing, this is a year thing, or many years. I'm here with you. Let's read it all. Let's meet the people. You want to call that author? I got their number. You want to talk to that person? We can do it. And let's see what happens. And again, I'm able to do that in my own life because I am so confident, and I've been so convinced, that this way of living that I'm doing is like radical, cool, transcendent, inclusive, all these things. But it's going to take a while for someone else to get there. And I'm sometimes honored to be that mentor to others.
Right. Do you mind if I ask another question? So do you think that it is, a lot of Christians tend to discredit LGBT Christians who don't accept the calling to celibacy as being maybe less than Christian or stuff like that. How do you, how do you navigate a conversation like that? And is that something that you encourage?
Yeah.
Can I answer first?
Please.
I think sometimes that's an opportunity for Christians that they really should be looking in the mirror and saying, kind of like the TV question, right? Why am I drawing the line right here? Why am I acting as if heterosexual sin is okay, right? That's the real problem, is a double standard. Your sin is worse than sin like mine, right? And so I think as Christians, we have to continually be looking in the mirror to say, God, search my heart. It doesn't say, God, search other people's hearts. It says, God, search my heart, O God, right? And so what sexual sin is in me? What areas am I convinced that I'm right and I'm wrong, right? And so I think that's where it has to start, but I'll let you answer.
I mean, a great mentor of mine says, like, a great Christian attitude to always have is, I'm the biggest sinner in the room. And it doesn't mean that I, literally am just so morbid, like, oh, I'm too depressed to function, I'm the biggest sinner in the room. It's just like, gosh, because I know all my own sin, before I'm out there pointing out everyone else's, it's like, oh, wait, this has to start with me. Like, I should be in any room I go into, it's like, well, I'm most familiar with my heart and my desires and inclinations, so before I'm out there pointing at others, I need to remember I'm the biggest sinner in the room. In terms of how does that live out functionally in friendship, I mean, authors you would know, I'm not going to say names here, it's like, we're very good friends. And the way our friendship looks is it's clear that it's like, gosh, I disagree with you in a way that's pretty big, and I'm still going to respect you. We're going to talk about our Christian ideas. I'm not in the business of, I mean, clearly in this moment, me not saying their names, and I don't want to call them out and say they're not Christian or all this, but it's like, gosh, we disagree in a pretty considerable way. And this might be surprising in an election year, that's worked out. I mean, we've stayed friendship. When people are like, how could you possibly be in community? It's like, we're in great community. There's great fellowship. I'm sure that by me being their friend over the long haul, I'm hoping they'll come to see things the way I do. I guarantee these people I'm thinking of feel the same way about me. They're hoping they can rub off on me, and we'll see what happens. I'm pretty confident. But to your point, it's not impossible to have those relationships, even when there is deep disagreement, and I don't want to sacrifice either, and know it's possible to not have to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great questions.
So I was wondering, so there are like a lot of people who are like against the LGBT community. They use the argument that like being gay is a sin, and then a lot of the LGBT community will argue back at that with, I've heard a lot that like there's something in the Bible that says something about man shall not lie with man, and how originally that was written as man shall not lie with boy, which can be interpreted as facing pedophilia.
Yeah.
So like, do you have any insight towards that?
Yeah. A few thoughts there. So one is, as it relates to some of those scriptures or approaches to scriptures of kind of dismantling all the so-called clobber passages, and even when I say so-called, it's like, maybe it's a deserving so-called. I mean, there are ways that these passages have been used to really beat gay folks down. I'd want to say there is a form of argumentation.
And so, just real quick, to catch people up.
Catch me up, yeah. You're right.
Not catch you up, but catch other people up. The clobber passages are a handful of passages that a lot of people who've been taught gay is wrong, anything gay is completely sinful, and I can quote you one of these three or so verses.
Yep.
Just
so here's,
there.
From Leviticus to answer some of your questions. So got some arguments from Leviticus, or have you ever read Romans 1 before? Do you know 1 Corinthians 6? And it's like, sure. What I'd want to say is some of the ways that people go about dismantling those, to me, is ultimately unpersuasive in that it kind of takes, well, this verse doesn't really mean what it says, and this verse didn't really mean that, and this one didn't say this in context, and actually when you get to there, this doesn't mean it either. And on a whole, a way that a lot of folks try to dismantle the clobber passages, in my mind, is just unpersuasive, because you have to so culturally relativize everything that they kind of lose their broader framework in the big biblical picture. So certainly, to your point, was there a problem around older men having sex with younger men in the ancient world? Sure. Was that in view for the biblical writers? Of course. But even this morning, how we kind of started in a Genesis, and then hopefully, I mean, we were trying to do so much in 30 minutes, but I think there's still a broad scriptural narrative around opposite genders engaging in this act where neither one knows the experience of the other, and it's two very unlike things joining in a unique union. That kind of argumentation of taking, well, this verse doesn't mean this and this verse doesn't mean that, it doesn't take into account, in my mind, that broader whole that exists in Scripture. And gosh, dissertations and books have been written about that. I hope that was good in a summary moment, but that's my 30-second version of that. In terms of people with kind of a broader anti-gay stance in a church, or folks that are, really mean and say it's a sin to be gay or it's a sin to this. I mean, that's where I want to lean into some of that conversation that we had of the fall earlier. It's like, I'm very uninterested in kind of certain conversations that go something like this, where it's trying to place like, where precisely is the sin taking place? Like, is it in you noticing this or feeling that, but then you act on it, but then you do this, but then you do that, blah, blah. It's just a weird way of sin management that sounds more like the Pharisees or the religious leaders of the New Testament to me than it does like Jesus. I think Jesus' invitation is always to follow. It's always a call to taking up a cross or doing something active. And of course, that means laying sin aside. But just when I'm talking with people in a discipleship sense, we can get so bogged down as like, was that the sin, or was that the sin, or was it this thing, or was it that thing? And it's like, bro, it's like, let's just follow Jesus more broadly. I think the Spirit will convict when it's a sin. I think you'll feel it. but like, let's do this. Let's try this. Let's follow in this way. And usually, in my opinion, and I don't think it's just a lax opinion, but those small ways of what's sin, what's not, those really work themselves out. The Holy Spirit's a great sanctifier. But just when the attention is on this sin, not sin, this thing, that thing, we get bogged down in really fruitless conversations that don't help people on their broader discipleship journey, in my opinion.
And so with any sexual sin, we've all had this struggle. And the easiest one to identify that the majority of people can relate to is pornography, right?
Yeah.
So is the sin in when I pleasured myself?
Yes.
Is the sin when I saw an
When I
image?
Googled it,
Is the
when I
sin when I got on the computer? Is the sin when I had the desire?
Yeah.
All I know is where this path led
Come on.
needs to be a heart issue I deal with. If I get into, okay, I can't log on to computers past 11:59 p.m.
I know.
Then that's the sin management.
And it's terrible behavior management. And as you've said, and we've all pastored so many folks in our churches with porn, it's like, we've got to change what your heart wants. We have to change your vision of the good and beautiful, how you treat other people. And it's like, sure, there's some boundaries that are good. There's some practices that are helpful or not helpful. But if it's going to last and be deeper discipleship, it's not won. The battle isn't won. And 11:55 versus 11:56.
Right.
Like,
what I hear you saying is we as Christians, we as the American church need to just talk better about heart issues.
Yes, yeah.
Because if we get into sin management, behavior management, then it gets into, let's draw a line about homosexuality or trans or adult or whatever it is, instead of let's deal with people's hearts, because that's what Jesus did.
Yeah.
And the overflow of that will work out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I had a real quick question for you, Tyler. My sister was wondering if you've ever been told that you look like John Mulaney.
I have been, and I did a John Mulaney photo shoot for a birthday. I have a postcard that I could send you, but yes, I totally heard that. Easy to hear.
All right, last question right here.
First off, I love that you have a John Mulaney postcard photo shoot.
Yeah.
My name is Joanna, and I wanted to thank both of you guys, Carl and Tyler, for creating this space so that we could talk about this. I really appreciated that you talked about your personal experience and the nuance that provided in this conversation. So for me, I'm a pansexual woman. I grew up in Texas. I was born in Virginia, so I'm so Southern, and that really dictated my experience of the church. And for me, my family is so a part of the church, and I was raised to really understand the sense of love and belonging. As I got older, that was whenever I started experiencing the hatred that can come from, feeling like you are teaching the scripture, but in a way where, for example, my pastor in Texas said that, anyone who's part of the LGBT community is going to hell and they're going to burn in hell. And that was a really aggressive way that pushed me away from my faith. So I really wanted to thank you both for creating this space where I could come back to that. And just like these people, the LGBTQ plus Bible group, really opened the door for that. So I really want to give a shout out to David as well. And I have two questions for you guys. The first is about creating a sense of belonging. And the second is, how do we figure out this cultural nuance that you can see inside of America, but also globally, since Christianity is everywhere? So for the first one, for belonging, I love this series about sounds questionable, and I'm wondering is it possible to continue these conversations where, in addition to Carl, we have, for example, David, who can provide some of those lived experiences of being able to ask those things that we really struggle with in our faith. So that was my first question.
Well, I can answer that. We're a church for broken people. And I think one of the big things that's important when it comes to sexuality, I'll give you a different example, okay? Everybody has been talking since this summer about race, right? Racism, is there systemic racism? If so, what does it look like? What does personal racism look like? What's the government's role in fixing that? What's the church's role in fixing that? How do we as a church combat that? And as a staff, we've even been talking about those type of issues. But what I challenged our staff with is, hey, look, if our Instagram is multiracial, if our stage is multiracial, if our group leaders are multiracial, and all that's true, but we as individuals only have friends like us, I think we've missed the heart of it, right? And so if I don't have friends of different age groups, of different marriage situations, who have older kids or don't have kids, who've gone to college and haven't gone to college, who are black, white, Asian, and everything else there is, and different sexual orientations or different sexual desires, then I'm missing it. All that to say, one thing I continually strive to do is hang out with people on the margins. One of the best things I was able to do in the last couple of years is our local partnership with the Samaritan Women had me come in every 3 weeks to lead a Bible study with these women who've been victims of human trafficking. And let me tell you, there's a lot of no BS people out there, but this was the top of the mountain. I mean, if they didn't like something I said on a sermon, they wouldn't let me sit down in the chair to lead the Bible study before they called me out on it. But I think it's only when we sit around a fire, have a drink with somebody who's different than us, then we can really understand their perspective. And then, if it's even the right setting, gain the authority to speak into their lives as Jesus would have us do. So that is something I personally do. That is something I hope all of our church does. It's almost kind of like if you're a super leader, a super non-believer, or someone with a quirky story, you get an inside track to hang out with Carl one-on-one. That's kind of what it is. Don't let the secret out. But we are trying to do that as leaders in this church.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think that leads into my second question about the cultural nuance, and I love that you bring up the issue of systemic racism, because I think we've all been learning that belonging is about being able to curate that process for everyone and not assuming that, like, people on the margins, that is from a perspective of the way that society has been built right now for cis, hetero, white men. And so, like, even the language of people on the margins, like, that is something that we're all growing in. And my question about cultural nuance is, so you referenced Preston Sprinkle, and inside the Bible group, we also talked about the inspiration for people to be loved. Justin Lee is the author.
Sure.
And I think some things that I learned and some questions that I have is, so how do we think about this in the greater picture, like what you referenced there? Because we are a church, but we're also a church inside of a country that's preventing LGBT people from having rights. And like you talked about the suicide rates, and for trans children, 92% of them try to commit suicide before the age of 25. And so, like, as a Christian, that like hurts my heart, and I don't know how to consider the cultural nuance of that. And another point that you brought up is, like, whenever we talk about Christianity going into different cultures, and then like being able to have this cultural revolution of recognizing LGBT, and like, but like I wonder about, for example, Filipino culture. I'm Taiwanese, but in Filipino culture, they had a more broad idea of what gender is, and so whenever Christianity came in and created this dual sexuality, then that like created the existence of LGBT culture. So I feel like there's so many questions that I have about, so what does that mean when Christianity is received differently in different culture? And like, how do you take that in consideration as we practice Christianity here in America?
Yeah, and that is where, and I hope I never sound like a broken record, but it is where my deep conviction that Jesus is the most beautiful, inclusive, loving, trustworthy, honest, stunning human being that's ever lived, shaped so much, because it's like, okay, then it's worthwhile to introduce Jesus to others and to invite people to consider following him. And it's something that missiologists have been thinking about forever. It's something that's shaped our culture forever. Like, how do we do that? Of course, in a respectful, culturally sensitive way. But on the macro level, this idea, like, we're not going to regret introducing people to Jesus, because when they meet him truly and honestly, it's beautiful, it's profoundly impacting, it invites them to, as John 10:10 said, to life that's truly life, to life that's captivating and compelling and full. And so the tension is to not let our own biases color that, to not let just because someone, told me this, I'm going to say that, but it might not mean this to you. I mean, there's all kinds of complexities there, but at the end of the day, it's like we won't regret introducing Jesus to others and won't regret introducing him truly and honestly and letting him be who he fully is, this beautiful person who came to earth as God to redeem. I mean, all these stuff, right? So that's, you're identifying the key tension of the Christian faith, but it's like, even with all those tensions in mind, so worth it to introduce people to Jesus and like a task that's worth being committed to.
Yeah, so really the answer to your question is to ask the question. Because once you get baptized, you are a missionary of Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's easier to think of, I spent a summer in Indonesia with missionaries. If you move to Indonesia, what do you got to do? Okay, you got to learn the language. You got to speak Indonesian. You got to learn their religion. And so I studied Islam. You got to learn the rhythms of culture and the values of culture. And then at some point after you make friends, you're finally going to be able to talk about Jesus, right? So when you are asking that question, you are thinking with that missionary mindset that every Christian is supposed to ask.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, and I loved what you said at the beginning where you're like studying the reasons why young Christians are leaving the church, and that when we talk about homosexuality, creating that nuance beyond just the simplicity of talking about sexuality. And for me, I think for me as a person, as a pansexual person, that is one aspect of who I am, but there's so much more to what that connects to and how I understand the way that I fit into culture. So I would love for this conversation to continue to be able to be expanded from the perspective of, so how do we, growing up in an American culture, do that more regularly as our population becomes more diverse, as we experience different cultures, how do we talk about this?
Okay, thanks. All right. You got one more? Okay.
Hi. So mine's a little of a different topic, but you had touched a little bit on singleness, and obviously you are single, and that resonated with me, so I kind of a two-parter on that. But so the first one being, how to change what my heart wants, because growing up in a Christian household, that's what I want. I want marriage, I want children, I want to develop that culture in my own home as well. So how to kind of change what my heart wants to what Jesus wants for me, what God wants for me. And then also how to navigate the loneliness that comes with singleness.
Great questions.
Yeah. In terms of the change what your heart wants, and without knowing all the nuances of your story, and this is where it's like coffee would be so much better, but it's like there is a category in Christianity that makes me love it, and it's hard to find in other faiths that says there's both a desire and a good desire that can exist in the world, and there's reality, and Jesus has experienced it all and occupies both. And so I'm not sure in your instance, and again, without knowing all the nuances, it's like I just know so many folks where it's like, gosh, I want so desperately to be in some kind of relationship, and yet for whatever reason that hasn't happened. What now, Lord? And the things I'd want to say there is just like, if there were a way to, quote, change your heart, it'd be more like, God, this isn't wasted time, and there's still beautiful, meaningful things that can happen here, and I'm not a second-class citizen in the church, and my church can honor and use my giftings as much as a married person, and I have valid experiences and opinions and all of that. That's the change I'd want to maybe advocate for in a heart, less like, oh, I just shouldn't want to be with anyone anymore, because again, without knowing all the nuances, like, maybe that's happening, maybe that's not, but there's like life now. And you've got meaningful things to contribute now. You're worth celebrating now. All that kind of stuff that I think churches miss out on. And it's infuriating sometimes, and yet it's real. But then in terms of kind of the other question, in terms of what do I do with the loneliness, this really is where I feel like churches that will figure out friendship and churches that'll figure out what it looks like for meaningful adult community that's not only organized around like kids and families are going to do really well in the future. Because just a little secret between the two of us, there's now more non-married people than married people in the United States. That happened a few censuses ago. There's so many single people. It's a massive mission field. There's so many churches without single pastors. All I'm saying is, like, if they'd start hiring some more and people saw them on stage, I see an explosion coming there. I think churches that figure out friendship well and figure out adult community well are going to surpass those that have put all their eggs in other baskets. I mean, in my mind, this is huge. This is next. It's part of why we're planning a church. But all that to say, what do I do with the loneliness? It's learning the art of friendship. I mean, Jesus was a friend. Jesus was not married, but had a best friend whose name was John. He said that greater love knows no one than this, but to lay down the lives for one spouse, no, friend. I think Jesus really, really understood what it meant to have deep connections with other people as a single person. To the extent that we recover that in the church, will be the extent that our communities flourish in the church. So all that to say, I mean, there is an art to friendship. Wes Hill talks about it. Christine Pohl's another one. Josh Jipp, there's people that talk about neighboring well. I might be geeking out again, but that'd be some of the stuff that comes to mind.
We expect it, Tyler.
Yeah.
Hey, why don't you end? I'm going to close this up in a second, but why don't you end by giving a challenge to the people of Mosaic?
Yeah. Gosh. I mean, here's what I see just coming to Mosaic. And like I said, I get to go to a lot of churches. I get to see a lot of churches beyond your awesome tech crew. I hope that you know that this culture that you have for asking questions is rare. And we heard about it even in one of the questions that came up. But this kind of open dialogue, this kind of space for honest conversation, I mean, if I'm imagining what it's been like to be where you are, there's probably some things you've heard set up here that you're like right on, and other stuff that's probably made you a little uncomfortable, or it's weird, or it's your first time hearing that. And all I would say is that is beautiful, that is next level, that is unique, and it is worth protecting and continuing to cultivate at all costs. I mean, when you're talking about being a church for the next generation, the ability to ask questions, the ability for people's questions that are, child-sized questions to grow into adult questions, all that, like, I see the roots of it here, and I love it. And so, I mean, my encourage or challenge would be like, do not let a frustration you might have with this kind of culture cause you to eject. Don't let one stray thing someone might say in this kind of environment make you think, there it is, my church is going to hell. Like, I mean, to sustain this kind of culture is difficult work. And to live in these kind of conversations and tensions is something that so many people just opt out of. But maybe it's knowing Carl, maybe it's getting to experience you all here now. It's like, you've got a unique thing going on that is worth protecting and worth sticking with and enduring through, even if there's a few stray comments or weird things you have to sit through. It's like, trust it, you don't want to go anywhere else. Like, this is where the action is happening. So I think my encouragement would be to like, stay committed to that kind of culture, and you'll be blown away by what God does. I mean, I honestly believe that.
Thanks, man. Let me just wrap this up here. We say we're a church for broken people. The problem is when you say that, you know who shows up?
Me.
Broken.
No, I'm kidding. No.
Broken people.
Yeah.
It's broken people. And broken people have hurts, they have past, they have questions, and they're not like you, and they're not like me. So I is broken people. Paul said, he doesn't say I was the worst of sinners, he says, I am the worst of sinners. And I think that made it a level playing ground for everybody to listen to Paul, because Paul didn't think he was better than anybody. But if we're going to reach everybody with the message that Jesus can connect you back to God, which we absolutely believe because of grace and because of truth, it does necessitate we enter into the stuff we don't know, and the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, and the people who are different than us. So make no mistake, we are a church that's based on Jesus, and we will hang on to the scriptures because Jesus says, I think it's John 6, in the scriptures you find me, and then John 10, I give you life. So that's why we're based on the scriptures, because that's where we find grace and truth. We're going to continue to navigate it. That's what the church does. Thank you all so much for being here. We all thank Tyler for being here today.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot, bud.
Thanks, Carl.
I appreciate it.